What would you do if you found yourself bound to a tree, unable to move with no help in sight? And what if, at that very moment, a powerful wild creature appeared, watching with curiosity, deciding your fate? The dense forest of Pacific Northwest had always been a sanctuary for the creatures that roamed. Its depths towering trees, their bark twisted by years of weathering, lying the trails casting long shadows that whispered stories of survival. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss pine and fresh rain, a world far removed from the bustle of human life. But this particular morning would bring something that no one could have expected. James, a Season 4's ranger, had spent years roaming the wilderness, often alone. He was accustomed to the sound of the wild, the distant calls of owls, at night the rustle leaves on the feet of elk, and the songs of rivers as they wound through the forest. But today, as he ventured deeper into the woods on his routine patrol, he could feel something was wrong. The air was too still, the usual chorus of birds and insects, strangely absent. James had been investigating reports of strange disturbances in the forest, signs of poaching, or perhaps a bear whose territory had been encroached upon. He was always cautious, always alert, but as he made his way through a thick patch of underbrush, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. Before he could react, he felt a sudden tug on his leg, and in a flash the world spun. A hidden snare, expertly laid, caught him by surprise. It was too late to break free, as thick, twisted ropes shot from the ground, wrapping around his body. The more he struggled, the tighter the ropes became, pulling him painfully against the trunk of an ancient tree. Within moments, he was helpless, completely immobilized. He was trapped in the back of his mind. James realized a forest had betrayed him. There was no one around, no way to escape, and no way to communicate his distress. The ropes dug into his skin, the pressure almost unbearable. What kind of trap was this? Who had set it? And why was it so precisely designed? As the minutes ticked by, the feeling of isolation began to sink in. James faced danger in these woods, before wild animals, storms, the unpredictability of nature. But this was different. The feeling of vulnerability was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Then from the shadows came a sound, low and rumbling. At first James thought it was a wind, but then the growl grew louder, unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat. The air shifted, and from between the trees emerged the source of the sound. A massive black bear, its dark glistening fur rippled as it moved its powerful body, cutting through the underbrush with effortless ease. James's breath caught in his throat as he looked into the bear's eyes. They were dark, almost human in their intensity. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The bear was no longer a wild creature simply roaming its territory. It was an unknown force watching James, evaluating him. As a considering what to do next, the bear's massive paws moved silently over forest floor, each step bringing it closer to the helpless ranger. Panic surged through James's chest. He had been trained to deal with wildlife, but this was different. He couldn't move, couldn't defend himself. What did the bear want? Would it attack, or was this something even more unexpected? Something that had never happened before in the wild. The bear's growl grew louder, but it didn't attack. Instead, it stepped forward, its massive form looming just inches away from James, and stopped. The ranger could feel the heat of its breath, smell the wildness in the air. The bear's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. It was watching him carefully, with an almost deliberate purpose. What was going through the bear's mind? James could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment. For a few heart-stopping seconds, neither of them moved, and then in a slow, deliberate motion, the bear reached forward, its large, powerful nose sniffing at the ropes that bound James to the tree. It was as if the bear recognized that James was not a threat. It seemed to understand, or at least sense, that the ranger was in distress. The bear's enormous head nudged the ropes gently, as if trying to figure out how to free him. James watched in stunned silence, unable to believe what was happening. In a world with a strong rule and survival was a constant struggle, this bear, a creature capable of tearing him apart in seconds, was not attacking. It was helping. It was showing a level of awareness and intelligence that was almost beyond comprehension. Could it be that the bear understood? Did it realize that this human was not a threat, but fellow creature? The unspoken bond between man and nature was often considered myth. But here in this quiet forest, something extraordinary was happening. The bear was making a choice, not just as a wild animal, but as something more. As a massive bear leaned in closer, its dark eyes never leaving James, the tension in the air grew thicker. The moment was suspended in time, a strange, surreal pause that seemed to stretch on forever. The force around them was still. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls muted by the weight of this extraordinary encounter. James's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The ropes tied around his limbs dug into his skin. But for the first time since the trap had ensnared him, he felt something other than panic. He was watching a wild creature act with an unexpected sense of purpose. An animal not driven by hunger or rage, but something else entirely. The bear nudged ropes again, its powerful snout pressing gently against the binding that held James captive. Its large black nose twitched, and for a moment, the creature seemed to be studying the ropes, as if trying to understand their purpose. The more James watched, the more it seemed that the bear was not just curious, but attempting to solve the problem. It was as if the bear understood that the man before was trapped, and that only the bear could do something about it. James could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The bear, once an embodiment of raw power and instinct, was now acting with surprising intelligence. It was clear that the bear wasn't just trying to harm him, it was trying to help in its own way. James's mind raced. How is this possible? Could a wild animal really possess the intelligence to recognize a person in distress? Could it understand the concept of a human in need of assistance? The ranger had spent years studying wildlife, and he had seen many things in the forest, but never anything like this. As the bear continued to sniff at the ropes, James's heart began to calm. There was no immediate danger. The bear wasn't here to attack him. It wasn't even showing signs of aggression. It was merely curious. James, still bound to the tree, felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The fear that had gripped him earlier began to dissolve, replaced by a feeling of awe and wonder. How often did someone get to witness something so extraordinary, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world? And then, as if in slow motion, the bear did something even more remarkable. With a powerful swipe of its paw, it gently tugged at the ropes. The sheer strength of its movements was evident, yet the bear's actions were deliberate, measured, almost cautious. The ropes shifted, loosened, and for the first time since the snare had caught him, James felt the tight grip begin to give way. The bear was in a sense cutting him free, helping him break free from the trap. James couldn't believe his eyes. Here was a creature, an apex predator, at the top of the food chain, choosing to help him. It was a decision that defied the basic laws of nature, where the strong survived, and the weak were left to fend for themselves. Yet in this moment the bear was demonstrating something more complex: empathy, a level of understanding that James had never imagined possible from an animal. For the first time since the trap had ensnared him, James spoke. His voice was shaky, but he couldn't stop himself. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. The bear didn't respond. Of course it didn't. It simply continued its work, its nose pressing against the ropes, once more gently, tugging at the fibers, as if it knew exactly how to untie the knots. It was as though the bear had become a quiet, intelligent ally in James' struggle for survival. James couldn't help but marvel at the creature's patience and care. The forest, once a place of danger, was now filled with a strange, unspoken bond between man and beast. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ropes gave way entirely. James was free, his arms and legs now unbound. He fell to his knees in a heap, exhausted from the struggle, but alive. The bear stood a few feet away, watching James intently. There was no threat in its eyes, only a calm curiosity. It didn't move toward, it didn't retreat into the forest. It simply remained where it stood, observing the human had just freed. James, still in awe, what had just happened, slowly rose to his feet. He was shaken, but he knew that he had just experienced something extraordinary. The bear hadn't just freed him from the snare. It had changed the way he saw the wild, and the animals that live within it. The encounter wasn't just a rescue. It was a reminder that there was more to nature than survival and instinct. There was connection, understanding, and even compassion. As the bear stood there silently watching him, James realized something else. He was no longer a mere observer of the forest. He had become part of its story, a witness to the extraordinary, a story of survival, empathy, and the unspoken connection between all living creatures. The bear turned and began to walk away, its massive frame moving silently through the trees. James watched as it disappeared into the forest, its form swallowed by the shadows. It was gone, leaving behind only the faintest imprint in the underbrush and the memory of what had just transpired. James stood there for a long moment, his heart still racing from the encounter. He knew he would never forget this day. The bear had shown him something profound, something that no one would believe unless they had seen it with their own eyes. And as he slowly made his way out of the forest, James knew one thing for certain: This was an encounter that would stay with him forever. As James made his way out of the forest, each step seemed to echo in his mind, as though the woods themselves were trying to leave an imprint on him. The encounter with the bear had shaken him to his core, and a lingering feeling of awe and disbelief remained heavy in his chest. It was as though the very essence of the forest had shifted, revealing a side of nature he had never understood until now. The path ahead seemed longer than usual. The once familiar landscape now felt foreign, as if the woods had transformed into something more mystical, something beyond a simple survivalist world he had known. The images of the bear, its dark eyes, its calm, deliberate actions, kept replaying his mind like a vivid dream. He had spent years studying wildlife, learning the behavior of animals, but nothing could have prepared him for what had just occurred. No textbook, no research, could explain the complexity of what he had witnessed. James walked slowly, reflecting on the inexplicable kindness shown by the bear. He had always believed that animals, particularly wild predators, operated on pure instinct. They hunted when hungry, fought when threatened, and lived by the law, the strongest surviving. The idea of an animal showing empathy, of it recognizing a creature in distress and offering help, was a concept so foreign to him that he struggled to grasp it fully. What had driven the bear to help him? Was it simply a random act of curiosity, or had the animal truly understood his plight? Was there something more to the wild than just a struggle for survival? These questions weighed heavily on his mind, but he knew that the answers, if they existed at all, would not be found in books or studies. They will be found in the quiet spaces between human understanding and the wild heart of nature. The encounter also made James think about the relationship between humans and animals. It was easy for people to view the forest as a separate world, a place to be explored and conquered. It was easy to view the animals within it as mere subject for research or targets for conservation efforts. But the bear had reminded him of something deeper, that humans were not separate from nature, but part of it. The boundary between mankind and the wild was not as clear as many believed. In that moment, trapped in a snare, with a bear standing beside him, James had felt a connection to the creature, not a superior being, but as a fellow part of the living world. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching the dry leaves beneath him. He looked up to see a fellow ranger approaching, a younger man named Tom, who had been assigned to patrol a different section of the forest. Tom had no idea what had happened, but the look on James's face must have conveyed a sense of unease. "Hey James, are you okay?" Tom asked, his voice full of concern. "You look different." James stopped and took a deep breath, glancing back at the path he had walked, as though expecting the bear to emerge in the trees at any moment. His hands still felt the lingering pressure of the ropes that had once bound him, but he didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Not to Tom, not to anyone. Words couldn't capture the depth of the experience. They would never be able to understand the connection he had felt to the forest, to the bear, and to the wild primal forces that pulsed through the earth. I don't really know how to explain it," James said after a pause. "But something happened out there, something different." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Different? What do you mean?" James hesitated. It was hard to find the right words. How could he explain that a bear, one of the most feared creatures in the forest, had shown him compassion, that it had helped him escape a trap? It sounded impossible, even to his own ears, but he had seen it with his own eyes. "I was trapped," James began slowly, "caught in a snare, and a bear helped me." Tom stared at him, clearly unsure what to make of the story. "A bear helped you?" James nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't attack me. It didn't harm me. It freed me. It's hard to believe, but it's the truth." Tom looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "The idea. Well, I guess we're lucky. It didn't try to make a meal out of you." James smiled faintly. He understood Tom's reaction. How could anyone believe him? The idea of a bear, a creature driven by instinct, offering help instead of harm, was too strange to comprehend. But James had lived through it. He had felt it, and somehow that was enough. As they continued walking back to the ranger station, the weight of the encounter began to settle into James's bones. There was no turning back now. He had seen something profound, something that no one else would believe, unless they too had experienced it firsthand. But as he looked ahead, he realized that the forest was no longer a place of simple survival. It was something more, something interconnected, with the lines between predator and prey, between man and beast, were not as clear-cut as he had once believed. The bear had shown him that the wild was more than a place for human conquest. It was a world of its own, with its own rules, its own rhythm, and sometimes those rules could surprise you. James couldn't help but feel that in some small way, the encounter had changed him. It had opened his eyes to the mysteries of the wild, mysteries that no one could fully understand, but that everyone at some point might encounter. And as he stepped into the clearing that led back to the station, he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget the bear. It had taught him something about the wild that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Days passed since the encounter with the bear, but James couldn't shake the experience. The images of that moment of the bear, nudging the ropes of his watchful eyes, remained vivid in his mind, as clear as the day it happened. His routine patrols continued, but they were different now. The forest, which had once felt like a place he understood, now seemed deeper, more complex. He could no longer view it as a simple landscape where humans were separate from nature. The incident had made James reconsider everything he knew about wildlife, about the creatures that roamed these woods. Before that moment, he had always considered himself protector of nature, a guardian of the forest. But now he realized it wasn't just about protection. It was about understanding. It was about seeing nature, not as something to be controlled, but as something to be respected. Something with its own consciousness, its own rhythms, its own complexities. The following days were filled with a quiet sense of reflection. James often found himself walking to the woods, not just on patrol, but as a visitor, a silent observer of a world that had always existed beyond his understanding. The wildlife he had studied, the trees he had catalogued, now seemed to hold secret stories he had yet to uncover. He was learning to see the forest in a new light, as if the veil between human perception and the true essence of nature had lifted. One morning, as he made his way along a familiar trail, something unexpected happened. The sun had just risen, and the mist still clung to the forest floor. The world was still save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional flutter of wings. But as James walked, he noticed something, a familiar presence in the distance, a shape moving silently through the trees, just on the edge of his vision. For a moment he hesitated. His mind flashed back to that day, the day the bear had freed him. Could it be? Had the creature returned? His heart raced as he moved closer, his steps silent against the soft forest floor. The shape moved with grace, its silhouette barely visible in the mist. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer, and there it was, the bear. The same massive black bear that had saved him weeks before. It stood still, its large form blending with the shadows, watching James with the same calm, intelligent gaze. There was no growl, no sign of aggression. The bear simply watched him, as if waiting for him to approach. James stood frozen for a moment, caught between awe and wonder. What was the bear doing here? Did it remember him? Was this another sign of the bond that had been formed between them during their first encounter? The air felt heavy with anticipation. There was something undeniably magnetic about the bear's presence and energy that seemed to pulse from the creature's form. It wasn't just the sheer size of the animal that commanded respect, but something more profound. It was a bear's calmness, its unspoken awareness of the space between it and James. It wasn't a predator sizing up its prey. It was something else, a creature that, despite its natural instincts, had shown an understanding of a human. It had freed James' breath quickened as he took another step closer. His eyes locked on the bear. The forest around them felt silent, as though it too was holding its breath. He didn't know whether to stay still, to retreat, or to approach. There was a part of him that longed to close the gap between them, to somehow connect with this creature. But he knew the forest had its own rules, its own pace for all its power and majesty. The bear was a part of that world, a world governed by instincts, survival, and unspoken bonds. The bear made no move. It didn't retreat into the forest, nor did it approach James. It simply stood there, observing him. It was as though the bear had made a silent decision to allow James into it world, to accept him as part of the wilderness it inhabited. Taking a deep breath, James stepped forward slowly, his heart still racing. He didn't know what he expected, whether the bear would react as it had the first time, or whether it would simply vanish into the trees. But he knew that this moment, this encounter, was important. The bear wasn't just an animal to be feared or studied. It was a living being with its own presence, its own space in the world. As James moved closer, the bear did not flinch. It didn't move at all. It simply stood there, watching him with an intensity that seemed almost knowing. It was as if the bear understood the bond between them, understood that they were no longer strangers. James stopped a few feet away, feeling a sense of awe wash over him. He had never felt this connected to the forest before, to the wild. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a calling, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of nature. The bear, with all its power and wildness, had shown him that he didn't move closer, nor did he try to touch the bear. Instead, he stood still, allowing the moment to linger. For the first time, James felt a profound respect for the wild. It was no longer about observing from a distance, or controlling what he could. It was about being present in that moment, in that space, without trying to impose anything on it. He was part of it, and for once that felt enough. The bear finally broke a silence. With a slow, deliberate motion, it turned and began to walk away, its massive form disappearing into the mist. It didn't look back, but James knew that the bear had communicated something important. It had shown him that there was no need for fear, no need for domination. The bear had chosen to share a moment with him, to accept him, and in that gesture, it had changed James' perception of the wild forever. As the bear disappeared from view, James stood still. His mind buzzed with the enormity of the encounter. He wasn't sure he would ever fully understand what happened between him and the bear, but he knew that the forest had shared something with him, a lesson that transcended words. For the first time in his life, James felt a deep, unwavering connection to the wild. He wasn't just a guardian of the forest anymore. He was a part of it. The boundaries between human and animal had blurred, and in that space, something extraordinary had taken place. The bear had shown him a new perspective, one where empathy and understanding didn't belong to just humans, but to every living creature that called a forest home. The encounter had redefined what it meant to be part of nature. It wasn't about controlling, observing from afar, or conquering the wild. It was about connection, about respecting the unseen threads that bound all living things. As James walked back through the woods, the weight of the experience still hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of peace. He had witnessed something rare, a bond formed, not by fear or domination, but by understanding and respect. And no matter what happened next, James knew that the wild would never feel the same again. Weeks passed, and life in the forest seemed to return to its usual rhythm. James resumed his patrols, checking the boundaries of the park, monitoring the wildlife, and ensuring that the balance between nature and human presence remained undisturbed. But the forest was no longer the same to him. It had changed in ways he couldn't easily explain to others, and maybe in ways that could be fully understood by anyone who hadn't experienced what he had. The connection he now felt with the wilderness was deeper than mere observation. He was no longer just a man walking to the woods. He was part of it. Every rustling leaf, every break in the underbrush, every animal track in the dirt now held meaning. And though the bear had not returned, James no longer felt alone in the woods. He felt watched over somehow, almost as if the spirit of the force itself was watching, acknowledging his presence. But there was a challenge he had yet to face. How could he explain what had happened, to tell people about the bear's actions, to share the story of how it had freed him from the trap? Would sound like a myth, an exaggeration. People wouldn't believe him, not because they didn't trust him, but because the nature of the encounter was so far beyond anything they could comprehend. James wasn't sure if he could even explain it to himself. How did he reconcile the experience of being freed by a bear, by an animal he had always viewed through the lens of danger and primal instinct, with a rational scientific world he had worked so hard to understand? He had studied animal behavior for years, but what the bear had done didn't fit into any textbook. It defied explanation. It was something beyond irrational, beyond survival, and it left James with more questions and answers. Despite the nagging questions that continued to swirl in his mind, James couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had opened something inside him, a new understanding, a new way of seeing the world around him. The forest, once an endless puzzle to be solved, now felt like an old friend, one with its own stories, its own truths, and he had been lucky enough to witness a small piece of that truth. One afternoon, as he was out on a routine patrol, James walked past a spot where the bear had freed him from the trap. The area looked different now. The underbrush had grown thicker, and the trees had a new sense of life to them, as though the forest was healing in its own way. James paused for a moment, looking around, remembering the calm presence of the bear. He had never been back to this spot, never dared come near it again. But something today urged him to stop and reflect. Standing there, the sounds of the forest seemed louder, as if the very heartbeat of the wilderness had grown stronger in his ears. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed himself to simply be present in the moment. He had always known that the forest was alive, but now he understood, on a level that went beyond words, the quiet strength of the trees, the gentle sway of the leaves, the constant hum of life. It was all interconnected, and he was a part of it. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing whether the bear would hear him or not. The words felt strange, coming out of his mouth, but they were the only ones that seemed to make sense. He owed the bear so much. His life, his perspective, a new way of seeing the world. The bear had given him a gift, one that he would never forget. As he stood there reflecting on his encounter, a sound broke the silence, a familiar rustling in the leaves. James turned his heart, leaping for a brief moment, half expecting to see the bear emerge in the trees once more. But it wasn't the bear. It was a family of deer, cautiously stepping into clearing. Their soft hooves barely made a sound, as they moved their dark eyes, alert and watchful. James smiled, knowing that this too was a sign of the forest acceptance. The deer creatures of grace and gentleness were no strangers to this place, and their presence was a reminder of the harmony that existed in the wilderness, an unspoken delicate balance between predator and prey, between life and death, between fear and understanding. The deer grazed peacefully in the clearing, their heads dipping low to nibble at the grass. James watched them for a moment, before turning to leave. His time in the forest was far from over, but he knew that the work ahead of him would be different now. He wasn't just a ranger anymore. He wasn't just a person guarding the wilderness. He was a part of it in ways he hadn't fully realized before. And that realization was as humbling as it was powerful. As James made his way back to the ranger station, he felt a new sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, or the bear would ever return, but he knew that the bond he had shared with that wild creature would stay with him forever. It had changed him, reshaped him into something more connected to the earth, to the creatures that lived in it, and to the very soul of the wilderness. The bear had left him with a gift, a lesson in empathy, in understanding, in seeing the wild, not as something to be controlled or feared, but as something to be respected and cherished. James couldn't help but wonder if perhaps that was the true purpose of his work all along, not just to protect the forest, but to learn from it, to understand, on a level deeper than science or observation could ever teach. And maybe, just maybe, he would pass that lesson on to others, to anyone who would listen, to show them that the wild was not a place of domination, but a place of connection, a place where even the most unexpected of creatures could teach us something profound about life. Months passed, and while the forest continued to thrive in its own timeless way, James felt that the changes within him were far more profound. He had been in this forest countless times before, walking its paths and observing its creatures, but now it seemed like a different place altogether. The forest, with its towering trees, the rhythmic rustle of leaves, and the constant hum of life, was no longer just a backdrop to his work. It was alive in a way he had never truly understood. The connection he had with the forest was no longer one of simple observation or stewardship. It was something deeper, more intimate. The encounter with the bear had unlocked something inside him, something primal. He had entered the forest as a ranger tasked with protecting the land and its creatures, but he was leaving it as something else entirely, a part of the wild. The boundaries between humanity and nature had blurred, and the forest was no longer just a place he walked through. It was a place he belonged to. James walked through the woods on his daily patrols, but the feeling was different now. Each step felt like a part of a larger story. His story, the forest story, the story of